This month's Where Did the Road Go is sponsored by Allison Cook, Tim, and Super Inframan. Thank you so very much. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Soraya.
Welcome to this special edition of Where Did the Road Go, where I am replaying a very old interview I did with Patrick Harpur. I was thinking about doing this, and Red Pill specifically asked me to redo this one and clean it up a little bit. The first time I talked to Patrick Harpur was July 20th, 2013. And it was a pre-recorded interview, which was not the case for the most part back then. I was doing them live at the radio station. In most cases, with Patrick being in the UK, it made it a little harder. So I had pre-recorded it, and my microphone sucks. And, well, not now, but back then, because I wasn't really doing them as pre-records. I was doing them live, as I said. So my end of this conversation sounds a little thin. His end sounds fine. So that's really the important part. But Patrick's been on since then in a roundtable with, I think, Tim Renner, and Joshua, I believe, were all involved. You can find that in the last year here on Where'd the Road Go. Patrick is a phenomenal author and an important author on the type of subjects we study. As a matter of fact, the new edition of Where the Footprints End, Volume 2, is actually dedicated to Patrick Harpur. He has had that much of an impact on me, and then I kind of pushed that impact over to Tim and Joshua, and they all read the book, Daimonic Reality, and it's a masterpiece. If you haven't read it, you need to. And so here's my interview with Patrick. It's cleaned up a little bit. I can only do so much with the recording. And again, this initially aired July 20th, 2013. Enjoy. Tonight on Where Did the Road Go, we're going to be talking to author Patrick Harpur, and an author of quite a few books, and we're going to get right into talking to him. Are you there, Patrick?
I am. Hi, Soraya. Nice to talk to you.
Yes, nice to talk to you as well. You have how many books out?
Well, I've got I wrote a couple of novels to kick off with, and then I wrote a very long book about alchemy, and then I wrote a book about visions and apparitions. I switched to non-fiction cunningly when the bottom fell out of the fiction market in England. Huh. And my latest book is about the soul. So I've got 6 in print and a new novel coming out this summer.
Oh, okay. Is that fiction or non-fiction? Oh, well, you said
it's a novel. Yeah, it's fiction. It's a complete departure. It's a comic novel. It's supposed to be funny. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, I haven't tried that before, so there we go.
Well, my first introduction to you was Daimonic Reality, a field guide to the otherworld.
Yes. Make sure you pronounce it so that it doesn't sound demonic.
Right. D-A-I.
Yes. It should be daimonic, really, but it's about the daimonic world rather than the demonic world, which is a different matter altogether.
Now, is the demonic world corrupted from that term?
It is. Yes. The word demon comes from the Greek daimon, and it was really it's all St. Paul's fault. He talks about the pagans worshipping daimons, and he condemns them, and so they became demonized by Christianity fairly early on. Whereas we know them better, of course, as not as demons, but as all the many beings that traditional cultures believe in, especially things like the elves in Europe and the beings that are very close to me because I'm Irish, which are the fairies and so on. So all traditional cultures believe in daimons, but they're very far from being demonic. Although they are ambiguous, they tend to be tricky to deal with at all times, so they can be malevolent as well as benevolent.
Okay. How did you get interested in this stuff?
I don't know, really. I suppose I just always was from an early age. You know, my father saw fairies in Ireland when he was a boy, which fascinated me. And it was all the more strange because he was what's called Anglo-Irish. That's to say a Protestant Irish whose culture is really English. And that culture didn't really believe in fairies. Only the native culture believed in them. Nevertheless, he saw them and believed in them and so on. And on my mother's side, she was very interested in spiritualism because her mother had been a very fine spiritualist medium. So I always had kind of, I was kind of brought up with the other world being around the corner, you know, just a whisper away, really. And despite I had the finest education in the world, or the finest education money could buy anyway, and it failed to drum this belief in the supernatural out of me, although it tried very hard. So I kept it going, and you know, when I got a bit older, I got very swept up in things like UFOs. You know, I thought, what the hell are they? You know, and I thought, well, I can probably find out what they are if I put my mind to it. It'll take me a couple of weeks. So 10 years later, you know, I raised my crazed, tear-stained face up off the piece of paper I was writing on, and thought, I'll never get to the bottom of this, but I did my best to write some kind of, you know, account of that sort of vision and apparition in Daimonic Reality. Yeah.
Well, it's different from everything else out there. The way you look at it, I think, is exactly what we need. We need sort of a new version of reality to understand these things.
Well, I think if you study UFOs, for instance, very carefully, they teach you that reality, because they themselves are that most theories about UFOs tend to cut out the bits they don't like, you know, whereas UFOs themselves are extremely ambivalent and ambiguous and paradoxical and weird. And if you allow them to lead you into if you accept that they represent a reality of some kind, then that reality is not the one you're brought up to believe in. But fortunately, you know, the thing that I discovered for myself, which gave me great joy, was that this different kind of reality existed in the past and still exists amongst indigenous, native, what I call traditional cultures. So it's not really alien to us at all. It's just that we've forgotten that way of looking at the world, which is, I think, a better and a truer way of looking at the world than the one we mostly subscribe to now. You know, the very reductive, materialist, rationalist view of the world just doesn't do justice to anything supernatural or visionary.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense to me. I hope it made sense to everyone out there. And one of the things you talk about in the book is how UFOs and other like sea monsters and things like that are all basically coming from the same source.
Yeah, that's right.
And this, I mean, how do you want to try and explain that to people? Do you think you can explain that to people who haven't read the book?
Well, let's put it this way. All these visionary things, I call them all daimons, because the Greeks believed in them. So I take I started with the Greek culture. The ancient Greeks believed that there was, that there was our ordinary world, and that there was another world altogether, which our world was based on. This comes straight out of Plato. He said there's an ideal world full of forms, and our world is just a copy of that world, you know, so we live in a shadow world. But the key thing is that between these two worlds, what connects them and allows them to communicate with each other is a thing that he called the soul of the world. And this is a very beautiful idea. The soul of the world is where the daemons live, not the gods who live in. The gods live in the super intelligible world, as he called it, but the in-between world is inhabited by daemons who connect us. Socrates said, you know, the daemons connect us to the gods. And this world is a strange, this soul of the world is a shape-shifting world. It's where the daemons can take on different forms. And they're always elusive, they're always marginal creatures, and so on. And I realized this is an exact description of UFOs, really, always paradoxical. And especially, one of the things that attracted me most to the daimons, or daemons as I often call them, is that they are both material and spiritual, which is an impossibility, of course, to our way of thinking. But that, of course, chimes very well with people's experience of UFOs as kind of ordered, structured spacecraft that seem to be very material. And yet, at the same time, they're ephemeral, evanescent. They can disappear just like that. Iamblichus, one of the great Neoplatonist thinkers, said the thing about daemons is they move much faster than we do. And that's often what we find with UFOs. They take off at the speed of light, and so forth. So in other words, the Greeks provided a complete description of their description of daemons or daimons, where fitted very well my experience of reading witness testimony of things like UFOs. And this soul of the world where they live later became what the Romantic thinkers, philosophers in Germany, and the Romantic poets in England called the imagination. In other words, for them, imagination wasn't something that was almost the opposite of what we think of it today. It wasn't a sort of way of making things up or of remembering things that aren't present to the senses. It was rather a whole different realm, a sort of autonomous realm with its own laws, peopled by gods and daemons, and which generated those strange, unauthored narratives that we call myths. And our job is to somehow contact that realm, through our own smaller imaginations, is to enter this large realm of imagination and inform ourselves about its denizens and its myths. And sorry, I'm rambling on a bit here, sir.
No, that's fine. That is fine.
But the last thing is that what I'm trying to say is the first model of this realm was the soul of the world, and the second model is what the Romantics call the imagination. And this in turn became what C.G. Jung, the great Swiss psychologist, called the collective unconscious. So they're all analogous to each other, those things.
Yes, you're very inspired by Jung, it seems.
Yeah, he was definitely my way into things in the first place. When I read Jung, I realized that he had a kind of model of the psyche of the soul, which did justice to my own experience. And of course, he wasn't on any curriculum. You don't get taught him in school, but
right.
You have to discover him for yourself. But that's the best way, really. And he was very inspiring. Yes.
It almost sounds like when you're talking about the soul of the world and the way they organize that out, it almost sounds like the holographic theory of the universe. That we are being projected from somewhere else.
It does, absolutely. Yes. Go
on.
So many. I'm rather against. No, I'm not against it. I was going to say that it's commonplace to say, in one of my books, The Philosopher's Secret Fire, which is a history of the imagination, I show how so many scientific theories are in fact literalized versions of much older imaginative views of the world. And so I always put imagination before science, because I think science is a form of imagining, which is itself kind of underpinned by various myths, which science itself doesn't acknowledge. A lot of science, I think, is a kind of literal version of older Gnostic myths and so on, but that's too difficult to get into now. I read a whole book about that.
All right. Well, I mean, the thing about UFOs that I think is so frustrating is you could almost say that they're all some kind of hallucination, or at least subjective phenomena, until they leave physical traces or have multiple witnesses, and then that idea just doesn't work anymore until we bring in what you're talking about here, where it can be both.
Yes, I'm a great both and man rather than an either or man. Yeah, exactly. But in the traditional view of the soul of the world, the soul wasn't confined to just inside us. It was outside us as well. That we are contained in soul as well as containing souls. So in other words, the whole question of inside and outside is thrown open. And indeed, I would say that we divided ourselves into an inside and an outside quite recently, only 3 centuries ago, with philosophers like, Descartes, who said, who divided the world into subject and object. And we began to look at the world like that. But traditional people don't. They have a much more participatory view of the universe, that they see themselves as one soul amongst many. And the whole of nature is in souls. In other words, it's natural for us to be what science calls animists, which is a rather unpleasant word because it's a rather pejorative word. It sort of writes off, what it pretends to describe. So I wouldn't say, that traditional people are animists. I'd say they just understand what is the case, which is that the whole world is ensouled, including us. And that kind of, I like to think that sort of dissolves this sort of problem of subject and object and whether things are outside us or inside us. When people see UFOs, sometimes they're more out there and sometimes they're more in here. Sometimes they're more subjective and sometimes they're more objective. But I think that's just the way things are. I think there is no hard and fast division between inside and outside.
And I think as long as people look at it like that, as if there is a division, they're not going to understand stuff like this.
I think that's right.
So, one of the interesting things you talk about in the book is how fiction, a lot of the like UFO cases and stuff were fictional stories first.
Do I talk about that?
I believe so, yes. I know it's been a while. There are some very fine books saying, oh yes, we only believe in UFOs because they were wonderful pulp fiction stories in the 30s and 40s. But I don't take that line actually. I think I tended to concentrate on people who'd actually seen UFOs. I think there was a specific case you talked about where maybe it was the first time UFOs knocked the lights out. We're in a fictional story, and then we actually saw it happen.
Oh, yeah, that's probably true. Yeah, it's probably true. But, I don't think there's a cause and effect relationship between these things. I think probably there are some ancient paintings with very strange circular objects in them, Circular objects in the sky are kind of not new. I have a feeling they are periodically thrown up by the great collective imagination, and at certain times they become, more popular than at other times. But it's no doubt that they began to be really grip us around the 1950s. And indeed, Jung wrote a very, very interesting paper about UFOs, and it's still one of the best things on the subject, I think. It hasn't been superseded.
Just so people know, when did the Daimonic Reality come out?
When did it, do you say?
Yes, when?
It came out in 95.
Okay.
So yes, nearly, 18 years ago nearly. Yeah.
So
it's still in print.
It got reprinted, didn't it? Didn't it get reprinted?
It's been reprinted several times. Yeah, there's a marvelous publisher out in Seattle called Tom Blaschko who publishes it. It's called the Pine Winds Press.
Yeah, and that's the version I have.
Yeah, that's right. But yes, it's only the Americans who are keeping me going. It's out of print in England.
Oh. Wow.
So God bless America.
Now, I would say it was safe to assume then that when people do something like ayahuasca and meet these different entities, or DMT and meet these different entities, would that be like us going to the Daimonic Reality as opposed to them coming here?
I think it would, yeah. Yeah. I wouldn't be a great expert on that. I've never taken any South American hallucinogens.
Neither have I, but I've read enough about them, and I mean they're very similar to UFO accounts and near-death experiences and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't quite know what the relationship is between non-drug-induced visions of the other world and drug-induced ones. Probably not much difference. I mean, I certainly think you can access that other world through hallucinogenic drugs. I mean, I did some acid back in the day, and I don't think it's as good acid as ayahuasca from what I read, but yeah, I think you can certainly access that other world. But whether it has the same transformative effect, I'm not sure. I don't know enough about it, but I'm sure it's the same place you go to, yeah.
Okay. When it comes up to something like missing time, or people who are not there for a period of time, do you think they just... I mean, how does one explain that as far as demonic reality goes? When you have a missing time, or someone who just goes missing during an abduction count or a missing time encounter or something like that?
There's a difference, Sarai, isn't there, between a problem you can solve and a mystery that you enter into. And we tend to treat mysteries like problems. We always think we have to solve everything. And a very good friend of mine called John Michel, who invented the New Age, he called it explanationism. He says that, someone's always put up to explain away difficult things. And some things you can't explain. Now, I'm not saying you can't explain this. It's just that I do know that it's a kind of an ancient mythical motif. You find it in fairy lore and you find it in myth. The idea that if people go into the other world, either they think they've been there for 20 years and it's only been a minute, or the other way around.
Right.
That they go missing for 20 years and it seems like a minute to them, It's an ancient thing, but then time is a very plastic medium. I mean, we've imposed all sorts of orderliness on it, but time can pass very quickly or very slowly. What happens to people during missing time is I don't know. I mean, I think it's a mystery. So I can't solve that problem, Soraya. It's part of the fascinating anomalies that surround UFO lore. It's just very interesting. But it is also interesting to know that it's not just a modern invention, that kind of thing, missing time and being displaced and so on, is an ancient motif. And we find witnesses to that in the past. Right. And, in other words, I haven't the faintest idea what's going on, and I wouldn't like to say. I don't have a theory that will solve that problem, but I do have a worldview that embraces that kind of mystery.
That's an awesome way of putting it. Well, your latest book, the U.S. edition, is called The Secret Tradition of the Soul, and what is the original title for it? Well, in England it was called, rather ambitiously, A Complete Guide to the Soul, which of course it isn't a complete guide to the soul. There's no such thing, and it's quite a short book, and it's very far from being comprehensive. But I have tried to. I didn't want to attempt a complete sort of definition of the soul. I wanted to write a book that was that was sort of intense and suggestive and provocative, rather than a book that was, in fact, a complete guide. So no wonder my American publishers very wisely ditched the English title. And it embraces that daimonic view of things, but in a different way. It doesn't deal so much with the paranormal, although it does in spots. You want to try and sum up a little bit of what it's about? Well, it's really about
is really about this traditional view of the soul that began with the Greeks, and before the Greeks, with traditional cultures, for instance, shamanic cultures. I think it's arguable, indeed it's fairly well established, that the Greeks were the first people to recognize a soul separate from the body, and they got that idea from Central Asia, that it came down through the Orphic cults and infiltrated Greek philosophy. And the Central Asian philosophers, of course, were the shamans who left their bodies and flew into the other world. So if you take that as a starting point, I try and emphasize this traditional view of the soul, but not only as a kind of individual entity, but also as a manifestation of this great soul of the world, so that where individual manifestations of this great collective soul, which connects everything there is, everything in the universe is connected by soul. That's the idea. And I also wanted to point out what was also traditional. I'm not making any of this up. I'm just trying to draw attention to this old tradition, which I think has just been neglected or ignored. And this tradition says that the chief faculty of the soul is not, for example, reason, as we've come to believe since the Enlightenment, but is in fact imagination, and that the great creative, shape-shifting imagination is what informs the universe. And the true stories of the soul, therefore, are the ancient myths, that they run our lives or underpin our lives without whether we know it or not. So we're all living out some kind of mythical story and so on. Freud intimated this when he hit on the Oedipus complex and so on. He thought that the whole of life could be reduced to 2 or 3 myths. But it was Jung who noticed that, in fact, all the myths are alive and well in the great soul, in the deep collective unconscious, and that they run our lives. And so really our lives are underpinned by gods and daimons, even though we don't know it. They're largely unconscious. And that's what the unconscious is made of. It's made of the daimons interacting in myths and running our lives for us. So that's the kind of thing I wanted to talk about. One of the impetuses for writing the Soul Book was the fact that I hadn't done justice in my earlier books to the notion of the personal daimon, that we each have a daimon attached to us, like a guardian angel. That's explained in Plato, of course. Well, everything's in Plato, really, so I'm afraid to say. But I wanted to write a longer piece about that. So that was one of the impetuses for it, about how we're assigned a daimon at birth. I never really believed that. I always took it with a pinch of salt. But it was while I was reading a lot of anthropology to understand, native beliefs about the soul, that I found that again and again and again, these cultures believe in the idea of a personal daimon, in a being that's attached to them at birth, which guides our lives and protects us, and so on. And I realized that I had to make this more central to my exposition of the soul than I had done hitherto. And so it goes on. So I talk about that a lot, and I talk about the importance of myths as the stories of the soul, and I end up by talking about what happens to us when we die, drawing on traditional sources once again, and trying to distinguish between the afterlife of the spirit and the afterlife of the soul. Spirit and soul is one of the distinctions I make.
Yeah, and it's an absolutely beautifully written book. I mean, it's almost poetic in reading it.
Oh, Sarai, you're too kind. Thank you.
Can you define a little better the difference between spirit and soul, so people have some context?
Well, it's very tricky, isn't it? I started from I started from my own experience, really. I'm just one of these people that always felt a conflict in themselves, I remember as a teenager feeling this great conflict between my intellectual self that was learning like mad and my emotional self, which was, all in pieces over being in love and so on. And our culture has traditionally tried to describe this division in ourselves. They've called it male and female. They've called it classic and romantic. They've called it yin and yang. They've called it, reason and emotion, or, and we have endless pairs of things that are opposite to describe this fundamental kind of tension and division we feel in ourselves. And I decided to call them spirit and soul, simply because those two words are often used interchangeably and so on. And it's very difficult to define what the difference is between them. You can only kind of evoke them in a poetic sort of way and hope that people recognize the difference between them. For instance, the spirit in us, loves, it describes itself in metaphors of ascending and height and light. But soul expresses itself in metaphors of descent and depth and darkness. But soul belongs to the underworld. Spirit's always sort of trying to get up high to the mountaintops. It's always trying to pursue the light, to pursue purity and so on, whereas soul doesn't like that at all. She recognizes that life is a kind of a muddle, and she prefers this slow, meandering, psychological route into the underworld and so on. And they're constantly at odds with each other, that whenever you're meditating in a spiritual state, soul will always complain and interrupt your high thoughts, your pure thoughts, with stomach rumblings and giggles and just wanting you to go off and read a good book, a story book, not a work of philosophy and so on.
Right.
But it's that sort of difference between the two. The spirit doesn't have much of a sense of humor. Spirit is all very spiritual, and it's rather humorless and high-minded and pure. And soul is far more to do with less to do with philosophy than poetry and jokes and puns and mud, that sort of thing. Soul doesn't have. Spirit always has big ideas which he thinks are new, but soul says there are no new ideas. There are only old ideas that we package, and what we must do is get more insight into the world, get to go inwards. So soul is psychological, really, whereas spirit is more theological. Spirit is always monotheistic; it always worships one God or one God above all. But soul recognizes many gods and many daimons and so on. So it believes in manyness as against oneness. And I think that's a tension a lot of us feel. We want to believe in one God, but we want to also acknowledge many powers. The traditional way, of course, is to be a Christian polytheist. That's what all the great alchemists and magicians were. And my hero, William Blake, the great poet, he was a Christian polytheist, and I'm one myself. So I'm a pagan Christian. That's the kind of state you get yourself into when you follow the traditional route.
Now, Jung had his own personal daemon that seemed to help along his work, didn't he? Yeah,
well, he did. He talks about it. Yeah, he talks about having this struggle with the daemon who drove him ruthlessly to perform his life's work. That the daemon can actually work against your will, of course, because it has plans for us. It wants us to self-realize, to what Jung called individuate, to become our true selves. And of course, that's often at odds with what we think we want, or what we wish, or what we desire. So he often spoke of the way the unconscious drove him into areas where he wasn't at all comfortable, and he called that unconscious impulse, the daimon, the personal daimon. He understood it. Socrates, of course, was the most famous possessor of a personal daimon. He was always giving him instructions. Actually, he wasn't. Socrates' daimon didn't say anything. He just said no. He only ever told Socrates when Socrates was about to do something displeasing to the gods, and so on. One of my favorite and most influential mentors was this Irish poet W.B. Yeats, and he speaks very touchingly about the daimon who ruthlessly has its way with him. And of course, it can be a sad thing, that it can often run counter to what you want to do, what you think you want to do with your life. You might have to give up someone you love because the daimon has decreed that that's not your path. So it's not an easy route, but it is the most meaningful route. The daimon doesn't save you from suffering, but he does bring great meaning to your life.
So you could equate the daimon with the higher self or the true self or something along those lines.
You could. Yes, exactly. Yes.
And do you think that they have an existence of their own, like a consciousness of their own, or are they only connected to us?
Well, Plato seems to think that, when they're done with us, they go on to someone else. So they seem to have a separate existence. But that's another very vexed question. The idea of what's personal and what's impersonal is extremely difficult. I sometimes think that the personal daimon is just the face that God shows to us. That there is a greater cosmic being who is completely impersonal. But paradoxically, daimonically, he can be personal. He or she can be personal as well. And the personal face he or she shows to us is the personal daimon. So there's always this overlap. It's very difficult to isolate these things, that they all flow into each other. I'm hoping that the exact relationship between things will be revealed to me when I die, but I can't be certain of that. That's just wishful thinking on my part.
Yeah, I think that's wishful thinking on most people's parts.
Well, yeah, maybe. I don't know. Yeah.
I think we all hope to get the answers to all the questions when we die.
Well, yes, maybe we should be taking ayahuasca now. Yeah, by finding out that way, I'm sure that I've spoken to ayahuasca takers, but mostly they have amazing visions, but they're usually not more enlightened.
Graham Hancock, who actually is a fan of your work as well, has done a lot of work. Yeah, he actually mentions you in his book Supernatural.
Good old Graham. Good. How nice of him.
And it seems to have changed his life considerably doing ayahuasca.
Has he? Good. I'm very pleased for him. Yeah, he's a good chap.
But he also recommends only doing it with a shaman who can guide you properly. Yes.
My only hesitation about that is, apart from pure fear,
right.
is also that it's not my culture. That's the thing. That's what holds me up.
Mm.
And that when I was younger, I was all for fleeing from my culture and took up Zen Buddhism and also and took LSD and all sorts of things, in order to try and transcend my own culture. And then I suddenly realized that, in fact, what you have to do is go into your own culture more deeply. And there are all these riches lying hidden, this wonderful deep tradition of poetry and the imagination and visionary poets like Blake and Yeats and the great visions of Plato, which are all there, but they weren't taught to you. So I think you have to look at, I think it's a question of looking more deeply into what's close at hand, And I found that these were my people. They belonged to my culture, but they had a completely different take on the culture, which was very congenial to me.
Okay, one of the stories you talk about in the Secret Tradition of the Soul is someone you just call AB, and how they had a brain tumor. You recall this?
Yeah, I do, yeah. Yeah, that was a fascinating story, and I just heard it on the radio, and then I later read an account of it in, I think it was in Fortean Times. Do you know that magazine?
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Where this woman is only referred to as AB, so I don't know her real name. I don't have any special insight into that, and it's not a personal anecdote and so on. But I heard these two accounts, and I heard her talking on the radio about this experience, which was quite extraordinary.
You want to explain it to people a little bit?
I don't think I can remember it. Why don't you explain it, Soraya?
I believe that she had a brain tumor, but she didn't know it. And a voice kept popping up in her head telling her to go to the doctor.
That's right. Yes, that's right.
And it turned out that she did have a brain tumor, and they wouldn't have seen it until it was too late. And she didn't want to listen to the voice and thought she was going insane.
She went to a psychiatrist. She thought she was going mad.
Yes.
And the psychiatrist couldn't find anything wrong with her. And then she forgot about it, went on holiday. And then the voices came back and said, look, get yourself to a hospital now. So she did, and she explained to the doctor, and he just kind of gave her a scan, more or less out of pity. And sure enough, there was a tumor which was successfully removed, yeah. And then the voices said, well, our work here is done, bye-bye, and left her, never spoke again, It was an extraordinary tale, yeah. I've never known such a direct sort of contact with I attribute it to the personal daimon, but it almost sounds as though they're not, actually. It sounds like they're a couple of spirit doctors who wander around doing good, like the Lone Ranger,
Or just keeping people maybe to a destiny somewhere along the lines?
I'm sorry?
Maybe keeping people to a destiny where they can?
Well, yes, that's right, maybe. I mean, we all wish that we had, clear instructions like that, but so few of us, most of us have to go through life we only hear the daimon through hunches and intuitions and, little flashes of insight, We don't get lovely, clear instructions saying, look, go to the doctor or else.
And you're familiar with a movie called The Beautiful Mind, aren't you?
I have seen it, yes.
And the main character in that movie, which I guess is a true story, had schizophrenia and was seeing people he didn't realize weren't real. Do you think that could connect to personal daemons as well?
That is a very vexed question. I mean, there's no doubt that people do have, bits of their psyche shear off and take on a kind of autonomous personality of their own. We find that in multiple personality disorder. Often these personalities, though, they often kind of represent one thing, and you can sort of see that they are just a kind of objectified aspect of these people. Rather than kind of independent daimons in their own right. But it's a very vexed question because all these things flow into each other, and I would hesitate to... It looked like this guy was more mentally ill than a visionary,
Right.
For instance, William Blake, he saw angels and dead people in his room all the time. But he never confused that with the real world. He always knew he was seeing a vision, and he always took them with a pinch of salt. They'd often tell him fibs, because demons are tricky. They can often mislead you, and so you always take them with a pinch of salt. So he kind of used them as imagery in his poetry. In other words, they enriched his art, and indeed his paintings. His paintings are of daimons, people, actually visionary creatures that he saw. So he paints, as it were, from the life. In the case of the poor old mathematician, whatever his name was, in The Beautiful Mind, he seemed to be plagued by these creatures, and indeed they could be suppressed by medication and so on, not done away with, but he could. And it's a very troubling subject because you do wonder how many people in lunatic asylums are suffering from mental health problems, which I suppose most are, and how many people are, possessed by evil spirits. We don't really like to talk about that, and I wouldn't like to come up with any. I don't think it's possible to say, If the drugs help, take the drugs, of course, if it makes your life possible. But I'm wondering also whether, how much when there are obviously cases when you have to confront your daimons, and what can seem, sometimes they can appear in a sinister way. In dreams we get this all the time. The daimon that appears in a dream to you can appear frightening and terrifying, but only because it's unknown. It's from the unknown unconscious. If you confront it, it notoriously can become benign and can lead you into an expansion of yourself, and so on. So I wouldn't like to make any large statements about so-called mental illness, except that it's not at all well understood even today, and that definitions of schizophrenia are still changing and are under review, and they change all the time. So it's an ongoing adventure. That I just think, on the whole, I'm not sure. I don't know. I think it has become a bit medicalized. I think we tend to medicalize everything, and I think that that's not always the best route to go. I think the application of imagination should be used rather than the heavy drugs in some instances. But
yeah,
I'm hesitant about this, Soraya. You can understand,
Oh, certainly.
And I wouldn't want to anybody to suffer more than they have to,
Yeah, well, go on.
No, I just think that our worldview is not very good at dealing with matters of the soul, because we don't really believe in it, And mental health problems are often soul disorders, and I do think we have to reimagine the whole thing, not turn it into a sort of physiological medical matter where you just hit people with heavy drugs. Somehow or other, you have to address the causes, but you may need a revolution in the way we regard our own psyches, to do this, and take a much more Jungian point of view, and less of a hardcore medical point of view. That's what I would like to see happening, but I don't see it happening anytime soon.
Yeah. Well, especially when you have people like Richard Dawkins out there that are pushing this materialistic sort of reductionist view of reality.
Well, poor old Dawkins, he's adorable, really, isn't he? I think he's going to be. I think he's sort of like St. Paul, He's so busy persecuting the weirdos, that he'll probably have a blinding vision on the road to Damascus one day and completely go the other way. That's what I hope for, anyway.
That would be interesting.
Yeah, I fear that won't happen, though. But no, he's like all fundamentalists. He's a bit annoying, but I don't think you want to take him too seriously.
But do you think? Because he's sort of sparked a whole new atheistic movement. Do you think that hurts the soul of the world? Sort of our connection to it.
Well, it's wrong, so I suppose it does. But what can you do? I don't think it's. I don't think it any. I don't think you can. You can't really fight fundamentalism, because it's sort of it's its own prison. You're sort of trapped inside it, whether it's religious or scientific. So I think you have to treat it with a pinch of salt and with good humour. And I don't know. I feel a bit sorry for any kind of fanatic, and Dawkins is rather trapped in his fanatical view that everything is only matter and rationality and so on. But unfortunately, I don't think that the ordinary people, who are much more sensible, take much notice of him, really, because everybody's had something weird happen to them, which has been meaningful, I should think, lots of people, millions of people have seen funny things, I should think 1 in 3 people in England have seen a ghost, or know someone who has.
Right.
And people like Dawkins just say they don't exist. Well, there's no answer to that, is there? I say, well, they do, There we have it.
What about synchronicities? What do you want to explain to people what synchronicities are first?
I'd much rather you did.
Okay.
If you're so keen.
It comes from Jung, who defines them basically as meaningful coincidences. Anything that isn't just a coincidence, but something that creates a state of revelation because of its connection.
That's a good description, really. Yes, I've always found meaningful coincidences. They give you a revelation, but you don't know what.
Yeah. You
just feel this great sense of meaning.
It's like, hey, that's connected to that. That's really, what does that mean?
Yes. You just think it's meaningful, but I don't know what that meaning is, And you end up not knowing, really. I do know that it's sort of possible to get into a state of mind where you see this in people who are questing like mad for the truth, and it's you go into a kind of a funny state when you're questing. John Keel describes this very well in Operation Trojan Horse, in which meaningful coincidences happen all the time, and they happen thicker and faster, and but in the end they become overwhelming, and you realize that the agency behind them, the daimons, are sort of playing a joke on you, and that it can go too far and so on, and you can go a little bit screwy, So you have to be a bit careful if you're having a lot of them, that the joke isn't on you,
Right.
But otherwise, yes, they're always good fun. They can be very useful, and the most useful synchronicities that I've come across happens to everybody who does research. And it's when you go into a library and you want the answer to something, and you think, I'll never find it because there are a million books in here, and then a book falls off the shelf in front of you and opens at the right page, and it's just the thing you want. Someone called that the operations of the library angel, and that's a kind of a meaningful coincidence. And everybody who's researched knows that experience, that they just find the very thing they want. But otherwise, they're not that useful.
All right. One of the things you talk about a lot is you kind of take the myths of ancient cultures as tales of soul and spirit. And do you think this is what they meant by them, or is it just a helpful interpretation of it?
I think they just thought they were true stories. But I don't think, like us, that they... I don't know. We think they're untrue. We think myths are things that are untrue because we think they're supposed to be literal, like the story of the Garden of Eden, for instance. That is a wonderful story, and it explains a lot about the origins of consciousness and all sorts of other things and so on. But I don't think it's literally true. I think it's a myth. But a myth is definitely a true story, if you see what I mean. It's a true story of the soul, but it's not literally true. And that's one of the great besetting sins of our cultures is this awful vice of literalism, whereby if a thing isn't literally the case, if it isn't a fact, then it's not true. But there are great poetic and metaphorical truths which are more true than the facts. And that's something that myths gives us. When we read myths, all interpretations really are just... don't tell us more about the original stories. They're just like retelling of the stories in different terms. You can't get behind myth and say this is what it really means. It is already a complete true story of the soul. Does that make any sense?
Yes. Yeah, it does. And I really like your chapter on mythology in here.
Yeah, I tend to give sort of psychological readings of them, and say, this means like, the myth of Psyche and Eros, and I translate it into psychological language, into Jungian language, if you like. But really, I don't want to do that. Really, I hate myself for doing that. Really, you should just leave the story alone, and just enjoy it and let it sink into you. And then it will begin to transform you, that its meaning will become apparent in your life. You will grasp it in that way, in an intuitive way, rather than kind of, I don't know, explaining it away in some psychological way or some other way, But I do it because I found that helpful myself, to understand the importance of myths. It's helped me to translate them into language other than their own.
Well, like I said, I really enjoyed what you did with it.
I'm glad. Yeah, good.
One of the things you talk about is the lack of initiations in our culture today, and how children not going through initiations into manhood could be causing part of the dysfunctionality of our world.
Yeah, I believe that, really. I think it's that was another spin-off from reading a lot of anthropology. Every culture worth its salt has initiation rites. Otherwise, you don't know who you are. You have to be initiated from childhood into adulthood, and you have to undergo. And the rituals are often the same or similar. They involve pain and suffering. They involve circumcision and fasting and trouble. But at the end of it, you get a wonderful revelation of the great creation myths of the tribe, and your life is filled with meaning, and so on. We tend to protect our children from pain and suffering wherever we can, and that's not always a good thing. We should have a structure which initiates them from childhood into adulthood. Otherwise, they stay children, and they're forced to try and initiate themselves through, wisely. Children are very imaginative, and they don't know they're doing it, but what they're trying to do is initiate themselves through forming gangs and mutilating themselves and having piercings and getting out of their heads on drugs and drink and rock and roll and so on. All these are traditional ways of expanding your consciousness and finding out who you are. And I'm very resentful of modern Western cultures which don't include those as proper ceremonies, sacred rites, which will enable children to pass properly into adulthood and become fully fledged members of the tribe. So I think we're to blame, and whenever children get out of hand and become unruly, I think we're to blame.
And at the same time, we couldn't go back to those type of initiations. We'd have to almost come up with something new.
Yeah, but yes, but people do kind of realize that when you get very dysfunctional children who are taken off into the wilds, aren't they? And various brat camps and so on, and they're forced to walk across deserts and build their own fires and sing songs, and that's very like the old tribal initiations, And 9 out of 10 times it works really well, but the children love it, because they're spoiling for a fight, and they want hardship, and they want difficulty. They want to test themselves against, brute conditions of nature and their own bodies and so on. So there must be ways, and indeed there are ways of if we've just applied a bit of imagination, we'll be able to think up rights and so on. We wouldn't necessarily have to, give them scars and circumcisions like they do in tribes. But,
right.
But maybe we do. Maybe we do circumcise them and give them a tattoo. Who knows? They do it to themselves, So why not?
Well, at least the tattoo part.
Yeah. Well, yes, I know. Yes, okay. We could cut out the circumcision then, if you like. But there must be some way of devising proper sacred ordeals so that people can find themselves, instead of being cosseted and protected from everything,
Well, do you think that maybe the UFO abduction phenomena might be a way of daimons sort of initiating us?
I wouldn't be surprised.
Because it does seem to hold some of the same symbolism.
Absolutely, yeah. I do touch on that in Daimonic Reality, that I think it's maybe one of the things that they're doing, that I do draw a direct parallel between the idea of, in tribal societies, that the elders will come to you in the dead of night with masks on, with big eyes and masks, and snatch you away and perform operations on you, And that's not a million miles away from aliens with their strange mask-like faces and big eyes coming in at the dead of night and whisking you into the strangely lit circular space and performing their diabolical operations. So I do think they may be connected. I think they may be spontaneous visionary initiations. And I think it would help abductees if they regard it as such, and indeed some do. Some people's lives are transformed. It's about transforming your life, imaginatively rather than literally, So, and I think some people do get that out of it.
That seemed to be where the late John Mack was going with things.
Yeah. Although I don't know. I had a bit of a... Funnily enough, I spoke to John Mack. He was in England. He died in England. Got hit by a bus.
Yeah.
But he phoned me up the day he was going to come and visit me, and he said he hadn't got time after all. He was going straight to London. The fool. He should have visited me. But anyway, we spoke on the phone, and we spoke about this. And I said, I hear you're working on a new book, and I think it was his last book, and he was explaining to me how he was convinced the abductee that the aliens who were abducting his people were on the whole quite good, and they had a kind of warning and about ecological disaster and so on. Mm-hmm. And I didn't like the sound of that. I thought he was kind of spiritualizing the whole thing a bit. I think if you go on regressing people and trying to get a positive message out of it, they end up, just kind of bog standard aliens who are warning you about impending ecological catastrophe. And I'm not sure that's what the little greys are doing at all. I think they're doing something more like initiation than prophesying ecological horror,
Yeah.
So I was slightly at odds with John Mack on that, and I did read his book in the end, and I thought he did rather sort of try and see the positive side of the aliens. And I do think they do have a positive side, but it's not the one that he wanted to emphasize, I don't think. I think he spiritualized them, whereas I want to keep them, in the underworld,
Right.
The dark forces of the soul working on us, the unconscious operating on our conscious minds and deconstructing us,
And I think whatever you use these words like imagination and stuff like that it's so ingrained into our heads and our culture that the unconscious is not real. The imagination is just what you make up. It's hard for people to redefine these things.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Yeah, well, it was hard for me, but almost all the words, myth, imagination, soul, all the words that are now thought to be just nothing, I think are the most important words. I want to flip the whole thing back again, really. And fortunately, there are precedents. I mean, there are, it is in our tradition. All the people are there. They're just neglected, but they're all waiting in the wings. All the poets and prophets and visionaries and alchemists and magicians, you can find them all and read them, And you can read, and the Neoplatonists, people like Plotinus and the Antiquarians, fantastic on the nature of the soul and imagination, really brilliant thinkers, So there is hope for us if we can just dig up these people again and read them for ourselves, which is really why I write books. I just want to draw attention to them, not to myself. That's the plan.
All right. You're on WVBR FM Ithaca. We're talking to Patrick Harpur, and I have a couple other things I wanted to get to with you, if you don't mind. One of the things you talk about is big dreams versus personal dreams. Now, what's the difference there?
Well, I took that straight from Jung, who talks about big dreams and personal dreams, and he got the expression big dreams from I can't remember, but a tribal people, either
Aborigine, I think.
Aborigine, was it? Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, but I think a lot of tribes have analogous expressions for two different kinds of dreams, and I think we know it in our personal lives. I think all of us have had at least one or two big dreams in our life, and we know it when we've had one. But we know the difference between kind of ordinary dreams, which seems to be about our everyday lives, and suddenly we can move within those dreams into a different realm where we seem to be encountering people, things that are not to do with our personal lives. A residue of our personal life will remain, of course, but they will be more like the realm of myth than the realm of our personal psychology. Have you not had a dream like that, Soraya?
Oh, I've had many dreams.
Many,
like
yeah. Well, there we are. So I think everybody knows, instinctively what a big dream is, but it seems to be it's much more real than normal dreams. You know that you've crossed that it's a real thing, but it's not. It's a different order of reality. It's not real in the way that our everyday world is real. I had a couple where I don't want to say what they are because it's boring, but I've dreamt that I've gone to sleep in the dream, if you see what I mean, and I've woken up again, but instead of waking up, in the ordinary world in my bed, I've woken up, as it were, on the other side of sleep, in some other place. So dreaming about sleeping was like a transition from this personal realm to the more impersonal realm of the great imagination and so on, where, I've encountered, the gods who are only peripherally to do with me,
Okay.
So I think most people have had that, and they should pay the closest attention to their big dreams, because, of course, if they are like visions and revelations, they are important for one's life, and they can be incredibly informative. And, a really big dream can stay with you all your life. It only lasts 3 minutes, but it can be one of the defining moments of your life, and you never forget it. So people should pay them more attention, whereas we're encouraged not to pay much attention to our dreams, sadly. But but they're always interesting and useful, if only to oneself.
And dreams are kind of an in-between state, where we're not necessarily in the physical world, but we obviously still are. And you find a lot of daimonic activity in that liminal in-between state, whether it be ghosts, poltergeists, UFOs. They seem to be in between two different states of reality.
Yes.
And that's what you're talking about when you're talking about the imagination.
Yes, I am. I'm saying that the imagination is one of the paradoxes of, Plato puts it best. It's one of the paradoxes of the soul of the world, that it constitutes the whole of reality. But at the same time, you can see it in another way as connecting material reality to a higher godlike reality. So in other words, it's both itself and all-inclusive, but it also acts as an intermediary as well. And the imagination is like that. But it is its own mythic other world, complete, autonomous and parallel to ours, as it were. But in another way, it also connects us to another order of reality. So one should always take notice of anything that's in between worlds. That's why the fairies always appear on, the daimons always appear on borderlines, between, at dusk or at dawn, or on bridges or on seashores, places where they are metaphorically in between states, between sea and land, or between light and dark, and so on. And that's where we should, and also between waking and sleeping, of course, where the diamonds often appear then. So one should always pay close attention to twilight states, in between states, liminal zones, as they're sometimes called, from the Latin limen, a threshold zones. But that's, of course, the very state which people pay least attention to. They like things, light or dark, not in between.
Right. You also make an analogy of the soul of the world, kind of, and the internet as it is today.
Yeah, I think the soul of the world is like an archetypal thing. I mean, I think it's a true thing that exists, although it's very hard to define or lay your hands on. And I think because we are embedded in it, we're always trying to act it out. We're always trying to body it forth, as it were. And in our rather benighted times, we try to make it literal. We're always trying to literalize these things. And I think the internet is a literalized version of the soul of the world, in which individual souls are interconnected like terminals, and so on. I think the god Hermes, the god of communication, is behind it all, and he's a notoriously tricky figure. But I think if you read all the myths connected with Hermes, the advantages and follies of the internet are all in those myths. That's my view. So I would urge your readers to go and read Greek myths as soon as they possibly can. They will immediately see how the god of how Hermes is behind it all. Nice.
All right. One of the last chapters it might even be the last chapter in the Secret Tradition of the Soul. You deal with death and what happens to us, and different accounts of that. What do you make of near-death experiences and such?
I'm happy with them. I think that. What do I make of them? I think it's quite possible to have a near-death experience.
So do you think it
doesn't trouble me in any way, and I think it's probably it's probably true as reported, if you see what I mean.
Do you think it's accurate to what happens when we die, or are we seeing something else?
Well, I've made quite a big study of medieval near-death experiences, which are framed in a different way from the way they are now, but essentially they're the same. But they have some interesting differences, whereby you kind of you meet your loved ones in the other world and so on. But there's always a kind of a threshold or a border which you don't cross, and you may glimpse the earthly paradise beyond it, but you know that even that is only a shadow of the real paradise beyond that again, and so on. So I think that people just get a get a glimpse, but they don't cross that border. But they may have, they often do, don't they, have that fantastic access of ecstasy and knowledge, and a feeling of being completely, of knowing everything, and of being completely safe and loved, and so on.
And a life review and things like that.
And the life review, yes, they get that as well. I think that's probably what we all have. But what goes on thereafter, the messages aren't that clear, because everybody's a bit out of reach by then. So I wouldn't like to, I do suggest the kinds of things that may happen to you thereafter, but it's, obviously almost futile to try and express it in words.
Right. You had a few accounts of people talking to those who were dead that were fairly interesting. But as you point out, a lot of the information is pretty mundane.
Yeah, that's always the trouble with it. That's what, having been a keen spiritualist in my teens, because my my mother was, and my grandmother was a good medium. My grandmother actually was in touch with the spirit of a pulp fiction writer called Edgar Wallace. Have you heard of him?
No.
He was an American pulp fiction writer in the 30s, and she wrote a whole novel by Edgar Wallace through automatic writing. So, which surprised her because she was a very mild old lady who'd never heard of Edgar Wallace, and this rather sort of racy novel coming up. Anyway, it is possible to yeah. So I was happy with. I was very interested in spiritualist communications because I thought, why, you're getting it from the horse's mouth. I was a truth seeker, but then the more I read, the more I found that either they were very bad writers or their messages were comparatively trivial and so on. There are exceptions to this. There are some good channeled works. Seth Speaks is a good one.
I was just going to bring that up.
That's quite good. But even then, I'm not very keen on Seth's prose style myself. I find it a bit boring after a while, a bit too spiritual, not not earthy and soulful, not poetic enough. So I try and explain that that when we enter the great imagination, that the world is more like the universe is more like music and poetry than these philosophers would have us believe.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask about Seth, because Seth seems to be one of the few that had a lot of detailed information and wasn't just giving out the same stuff over and over again.
Yeah.
But it is a sort of a materialistic view. But he also said he would you consider him to be her personal daemon?
Who, Seth?
Yes. Would she be Jane Roberts' personal daemon in a sense?
Could be, yeah. He could be, couldn't he? Yeah. But at the same time, he sometimes hints that he's not. He sometimes hints that, yeah, I'd like to know that. He could be, he's not, the way he talks is not inconsistent with the utterances of the personal daemon, yeah. So,
one of the things he always said is that what you were hearing was a combination of him and Jane, that since he was talking through her, and that he would never be channeled by anyone else because that combination wouldn't be there again.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, that rather argues in favor of it, doesn't it? Yeah, that's a good point. I like that.
Hmm.
All right. You didn't really talk too much about reincarnation in the afterlife section. Are you not? Do you think that's not applicable to the subject?
It was just too big a subject to tackle, and I'm not really qualified to talk about it.
All right.
Also, I have a slight aversion to it, reincarnation. It often seems to me a kind of way of getting around is a sort of literalized version of immortality. But there are also, there are different kinds of reincarnation. The Greeks believed in metempsychosis, which is the transference of the soul, whereas Hindu philosophy believes something slightly different. That you can work out your karma, what you've accumulated, which is one removed from the soul, and so on. So it was too vexed a question to get into, really. But I did touch on it. I did say I did try and fit it into my into what I was saying about the other world being an imaginative state. So I touched on it in that way. But it would require, several books on their own to get into reincarnation. So it was more a matter of personal choice on my part, that I'm just not that interested in it.
Yeah,
I do think it's incredibly important. It's just not my personal bag, It doesn't suit my temperament, reincarnation. But I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. I just don't know. I think it probably does, because on balance, more cultures believe in it than cultures that don't. So I think it probably does, but I'm not quite sure how the mechanics of it are going to work, That's
right.
All. In other words, I have a lot of complicated views about reincarnation, which I'm going to have to put in a separate book. If I ever do write another one, yeah.
I was just going to ask you that. Do you have any other... I mean, you're working on this work of fiction now. How long before that is released?
Oh, well, that's done. That's coming out in a couple of months, yeah. That's the comic novel.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what is that about?
It's based not at all loosely on my own family growing up in the early 60s. So it's about a bunch of kids growing up in the home counties of England, and what happens when their parents misbehave. There's madness and death in it, but mostly there are a lot of jokes. I hope funny. I grew up in an interesting place. I grew up in a very wealthy suburb of London, where just when I was becoming a teenager, it became very fashionable, and all these rock stars moved into the district, including John Lennon and George Harrison. So I put them in the book, and indeed the book's called The Savoy Truffle, which is the title of a George Harrison song, and I reveal how he got the title of that song in the book.
Okay. And the book before that is The Secret Tradition of the Soul. At least in the U.S., it's The Secret Tradition of the Soul.
Yes.
And you have a few before that, including one on alchemy. Now, the alchemy one is fiction, right?
It's half fiction and half not.
Okay.
It's daimonic in that respect. It spans, it's neither nor, I'm afraid. And that's called Mercurius. As in Mercury, but the Latin Mercurius, yeah. And that's kind of that was my big initiatory work. That's writing that. I wanted to write about alchemy, but I got sucked in, and it became a work of alchemy, and it completely changed me. It kind of turned my world upside down. And I couldn't have written Daimonic Reality without having written the alchemical book first, if you see what I mean. That was my initiation into the other world. Yeah.
All right.
But my biggest summary but my best, almost complete summary of the worldview is my book which I call The Philosopher's Secret Fire: A History of the Imagination.
Okay, that came out after Daimonic Reality?
Yes, it did. It was the one that came out after that, and that's where I try and do the whole culture thing and explain about the myths behind science and the importance of myth and the imaginative tradition.
All right. And your website is patrickharpur.org?
It's www.harpur.org / Patrick. I share it with my sister and brother, so it's harpur.org / Patrick.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Patrick. This has been a great interview.
And I want to take a moment here to send a thank you out to all of my Patreons. It's because of you that this show is possible, and I really mean that. And a special thank you and shout out to those pledging $10 or more: Super Inframan, Allison Cook, Tim, Nagatha Christie, Patricia W., Barbara Fisher, Will Powell, Big Boy Limina, Craig Parmenter, Walker, Johanna Rojas, Maddie, David Moore, Vincent Trewell, Stone Wilderness, Luke Osborne, Becky Trainer, Rob Drummond, Alex Whitcomb, Edu Camahort, Tactical Therapist, Janet Bunderson, 36 Dingo, Taylor, Sam Sharon, Jennifer Campbell, American Rambler, Kevin, John Rutledge Foster III, Eric Citron, Andy McNamara, Sasha Jorg, Dorcamus Prime, Sedgder, Dominic O'Malley, Riker and Stark, J. Otto Bullitt, Jose A., Charles Davis, Roger Gonzalez, Craig Cicernos, Ray Benedetto, Linz Jackson K., Alfred Tuttle, Matthew Sproul, Kevin Schreck, Patricia Guy Quinta, William Lovelace, Mark Brady, and Carla Mahoney. Thank you all so very much. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.